Welcome to the Missionary Mobilization Podcast, a resource for Christian leaders who want to increase the number of missionaries around the world. This podcast is a ministry of the Center for Missionary Mobilization and Retention at Trinity Bible College and Graduate School. Visit us online at missionarymobilization.org. Now, here's your host, the founder and director of the Center for Missionary Mobilization and Retention, David Jacob.
Well, hi, everybody, and thanks for listening. Welcome to the Missionary Mobilization Podcast. As you know, our goal is to equip and encourage mobilizers and missions pastors from around the world, and we'd love to hear how you like the show. So if you've got any suggestions for show topics, please get a hold of us through our website. Just drop us a note there. And also, don't forget to subscribe to the podcast on Apple Podcasts, Google Play, Stitcher, or Spotify. Before we get started today, we'd like to thank Assemblies of God World Missions who help sponsor this podcast. As one of the largest mission-sending organizations in the world, their primary goal is to see the church established among all peoples everywhere. You can check them out at agwm.org for more information. Our topic for today is mobilizing prayer for the Buddhist world, and our guest is Mark Durene. Mark grew up in a Christian family in rural Minnesota. He received a BA in Intercultural Studies from North Central University and then pastored in Minneapolis for 4 years. He was a missionary in northern Thailand for 19 years before moving to Bangkok, where he now leads Pen Asia Foundation, which serves the 5 nations of Vietnam, Cambodia, Laos, Thailand, and Myanmar. Mark is a big fan of Change the Map and is involved with Change the Map, a prayer initiative for the Buddhist world. He and his wife have 3 children and 8 grandchildren. Mark, welcome to the show.
Thank you, Dave. It's good to be here. Good to be with you again.
I'm excited about our conversation today and how we can mobilize prayer for the Buddhist world. And let's just start off just wondering how God called you into missions.
That was a long time ago now, but it's a story I'm sure you've heard before. In my hometown church of Little Falls Assemblies of God, we had a missionary from MAF, Missionary Aviation Fellowship, come and show the film Jungle Pilot. And it was from Nate Saint's perspective, the pilot of the airplane that went down in Ecuador and involved the loss of life of 5 missionaries, the martyrdom really of 5 missionaries there. And I think I was about 14 years old when that happened. And the Holy Spirit just really gripped my heart with that story. And I knew from that time on, I was going to be a missionary.
Wow. Amazing. That's remarkable what God uses to call those that He is calling to the mission field. So you've served now in the Buddhist world for many, many years. Can you give us an overview of Buddhism?
Wow. Buddhism is not easy to understand. And most people we talk to really have very little clue what it teaches and what it's about. And part of that, Dave, is because it varies so much in different parts of the world. But basically, Buddha was a Hindu. I like to say that Buddha was a Hindu. He was a man that was born about 540 some years BC, before Christ, toward the end of our Old Testament. And he grew up in northern India in a Hindu family. He was royalty, part of a royal family, a very protected life. And when he became of age, he was allowed to go out of the palace for the first time in his life. And during that time, he observed suffering for the first time, pain, old age, death. And on all of these things shocked him. And he decided that Hinduism and his old way of thinking and believing was not right, and went on a search for truth. And his search brought him through all kinds of trials, suffering. He tried many different paths to truth. And finally, through meditation, sitting under the bo tree. After extensive meditation, he was enlightened to truth of the four we call four pillars, or the four noble truths of Buddhism. And those are the four noble truths that any kind of Buddhist anywhere in the world will live and abide by, or will believe in. Actually, Buddhism is more a religion of practice than it is of belief. So most Buddhists know what they practice more than what they believe. But all Buddhists basically have that four noble truths foundation, and they really create the foundation that is so opposite of Christianity. It's most people just really have no clue how opposite Buddhism is from Christianity. They think Buddhism is a nice, peaceful, thoughtful, meditative kind of a religion, but from the very foundations, it's the very opposite of Christianity.
So what are some of those differences? I think it's helpful for our listeners to really understand the differences between Christianity and Buddhism so that we can be more effective in mobilizing prayer for the Buddhist world. What are some of the differences between Christianity and Buddhism?
Well, good. I'll try to make this quick. Let me approach it this way, Dave. If you were to tell a typical Buddhist person, especially here in Southeast Asia, if you were to use John 3:16 to try to explain the gospel to them, it would most likely come across completely unrecognizable. They would receive it in a very different way. And here's what I mean. When you say to them, "For God so loved the world," you've already lost them, because number one, there's not a belief in God in Buddhism, or a creator God or ultimate God that lives outside the realm of this existence. There's no concept of that. And even Buddha himself was asked that question at one point, does God exist? And his answer was that if God does exist, if there is a God, and we don't even know, but if there is a God, he's an evil God. And the reason he's an evil God is because of the four pillars of Buddhism, which begin with number one, life is suffering. All of existence is suffering. Buddha taught that we were born in this birth tube of our mother in pain and suffering, and then we come out and we are subject to all of the growth pains and the sicknesses and the problems of the earth and living our life, and then we die in even greater pain and suffering, and we're reborn again into this endless cycle of birth, death, and rebirth. And we're trapped basically in a cycle of suffering. And so all of living, all of life, all of existence is really suffering and ignorance. And so the goal of life really is to escape life, is to escape existence. And so the second noble truth is that suffering is caused by desires. Buddha felt like if we can remove all desires from our life, every desire, whether it's an evil desire or a bad desire, it's a desire that keeps us attached to this world. And so Buddha taught that every desire, including the desire of love, was a bad thing. And so when we say, "For God so loved the world," we're saying that if there is a God, he's an evil God because he created a world of suffering. And two, he's a God who loves, which means that he's a weak God because he's attached to things by love. He's not. There was once a debate here in Bangkok between the major religions, and the question was asked, what's the biggest concept of your faith, of your religion? And the Christian answer was love. God is a God of love. He wants us to love him. He calls us to love each other. But the Buddhist monk stood up next and said, the greatest enemy to Buddhism is love, because love is the hardest of all the desires to remove from our lives. And if we can get to the point where we can actually not have to love someone or be loved, then we're getting close to reaching and attaining enlightenment. And in the eyes of a Buddhist, that's a very superior answer. And
Hmm.
so then we say, God loved the world so much, he sent his son Jesus to suffer and die on the cross in our place. And a Buddhist will look at suffering and the agony of Christ on the cross in a very negative way, because anyone who dies a violent death in this part of the world and in Buddhist thought is a person who has bad karma. We
Hmm.
understand karma is the results. We're living the fruits of previous existences, previous lives. And so anyone that dies a violent death was a violent person in a previous life. So Jesus then would be seen in this great violent suffering death, that he was probably a very violent person in his previous life. And then uh, we would say that whoever believes in him would have everlasting life. And the Buddhist would say, well, everlasting life is what we already have,
Yeah,
because
they're trying to get out of it,
we're trying
right?
to get out of it. Yeah,
Yeah.
we're locked in this existence, and we want to get out of
Hmm.
it. So, using
Sure.
John 3:16 highlights really some of the major differences between Buddhism and Christianity.
Wow, definitely. And I think that really speaks to as well the importance of education as we're mobilizing others, the importance of studying world religions, studying contextualization, intercultural communication. All those things are really important as well as we mobilize people. And I know,
Yes.
again, you've worked in the Buddhist world for quite some time, and so it sounds pretty challenging as far as reaching Buddhists for the Lord. Do you have any experiences you can share about the difficulty of reaching Buddhists?
Wow, there are so many. Uh, uh, let me use this one. Uh, Janie and I, my wife and I, were privileged to work with when we were up in Chiang Mai a few years ago, to work in a smaller village where we were invited to come into a household and teach the local people about Christianity. What does it mean to be a Christian in a place where people had never really didn't even know who Jesus was, knew nothing about Christianity, and so we obviously didn't start with John 3:16. And so, where do you start when you start with someone that has no clue? You
Mm,
start with Genesis 1:1, and Genesis 1:1 and 2, the first two chapters of Genesis, describe the world that God created, but a world that is completely absent of suffering, which is the key word for Buddhist peoples. Buddha did not deal with the origin of suffering. He only
mm,
observed that life was suffering and painful. And so, so we talked to this group in the first few weeks that we met together about the where suffering came from, that God is real, that God, here are evidences of God's creation, so forth, and that the creation that God created was really a good creation. There was no death, no dying, no suffering, no pain in childbirth, no thorns and thistles. That none of those things existed in Genesis 1 and 2, and it was only after uh, mankind, Adam and Eve, rejected God and rebelled against God, that Genesis chapter 3 introduces suffering into the world. And so we don't talk about sin, we talk about suffering here when
mhm,
we talk to Buddhist peoples. And we their eyes began to open, and they became interested, and to think that maybe God is real, maybe he's a good God, and maybe there's information they've never heard of, which is the origin of suffering. And we went on to Genesis chapter 4, and this was, Dave, probably 6-7 weeks into the study. We had about 15 people coming each Thursday night to this little tiny house, and sitting and listening to these stories from the Old Testament.
mm,
And we talked about Cain and Abel in Genesis chapter 4, and how God did not accept Cain's offering of grains, but he accepted Abel's offering of an animal, of most likely a lamb. And they were shocked, and they said, well, if God is good, why did he accept a killing of an animal? I thought that God was good. Why does he like killing animals? And so that was one of many, many,
Wow.
many misunderstandings and challenges in leading this group to know Jesus. And so we had to go back at that point and point out a couple of very important things from Genesis chapter 2. When God said he created man, he created them in his own image. People were the only one of God's creation that were in God's own image, and God created them like himself. And which is with a spirit, a spiritual being, when the animals and the rest of the creation did not have that spiritual being. And they said to me, how do you know that animals don't have a spirit? And and the Holy Spirit helped me in that moment. And I said to them, uh, have you ever seen a monkey, which is generally considered the most intelligent of the animals in this part of the world? Have you ever seen a monkey offering any kind of a sacrifice before an idol, or praying, or meditating, or doing anything
Mm.
religious? And they laughed. They said, no, 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 we've never seen that. That doesn't happen. And I
Mhm.
said, yet why is it that people all over the world, and even people in the remotest part of this Pacific Ocean that's never been discovered before, why do people everywhere have gods? Why do they seek some sort of spiritual thing in their life? It's because they have a spirit inside of them and animals don't. And they said, okay, we accept that. And
Mm.
then secondly, I said, when God promised Adam and Eve that if they sinned, or if they rebelled against him, that there had to be death involved, that with sin, that death accompanies sin. And so that they really should have died for their sins, but God allowed for the death of an animal to be a substitutionary death on their behalf, to show that he loved them, not because he loves to kill animals, but because he loved them so much. And he was actually representing the fact that in the future he would die for their sins and shed his own blood for them. And that began to make sense to them. But that was one, Dave, of so many misunderstandings that Buddhist people have. In fact, I know I'm going long here, but let me tell you one other pretty cool thing that happened with this group. We went
Sure.
through several of these obstacles with this group, and but yet they wouldn't take the step of faith, saying, in fact, they were willing to say, we're seekers of you, but not quite believers, full believers, to get water baptized. And I couldn't figure out for a long time why they weren't quite ready to take that final step. And they kept asking what would happen to their bodies when they died. And I found out the barrier there was that the belief system in these villages, and in much of Southeast Asia, is that the the way that your body is handled when you die determines how long your ghost is going to hang around and bother people after you're dead.
Wow.
So that was their thing. And they said to me, we don't believe that there's going to be a ghost hanging around. We don't believe that, but the rest of the village does. And so when we die, if our bodies are not handled exactly like the monks prescribe, then every bad thing that happens in this village from now on will be blamed on us, the Christians. They'll say it's
Mm.
because you weren't handled correctly when you died, and now the Christian wasn't handled correctly when they died. Now their ghost is haunting us and doing all of these horrible things to our village. And they didn't want to leave that legacy for their children and their relatives, so that was keeping them back from being a Christian. And so we prayed about this. We thought, how can we solve this kind of problem? How can we ever handle a dead person in the way that will satisfy this village, that we've done it in the right way and their ghost is not going to come back and bother people? It's not the kind of a problem you study in Bible school.
I
And
suppose.
yeah, and so one day, the leader of this group came to me, and this is like a year and a half into our coming up there and sharing the gospel with this group of people. And she said to us, "Hey, guess what happened? Just yesterday, a lady from our village passed away, and she had dedicated her body to science to the university down in the city, and they called the university immediately when she died, and they sent a ambulance up, and they got her body and took it to the university, and it's gone, and everybody is fine with that. And so I went to the university today, and I dedicated my body to science. And
Mm,
so I'm ready to get water baptized. I'm ready to be a Christian now, because now when I die, I'll be fine, and the village will be
wow.
fine, my family will be fine. And so she solved the problem. A few weeks later, her husband came to me and said, "Hey, you know what I did yesterday? I dedicated my body to the university, so I'm ready to be water baptized and be a believer as well." So,
Wow.
God has an answer. There's so many barriers, but God does have an answer for these
Y-
questions.
Yeah, indeed, and all these challenges just put an emphasis on the need for prayer. And I know you're
Right.
heavily involved with Change the Map. Can you explain a little bit about what that is?
Man, this is an initiative that should have started years and years ago. Change the Map is an initiative to raise up tens of thousands of intercessors on behalf of the Buddhist world. People just don't know how powerful that the spiritual forces are in the Buddhist world. Everywhere that you look, here in Southeast Asia especially, but everywhere you look where there are Buddhist populations, there are very, very small percentages of Christians. All five of the countries that I work in, the majority people group are Buddhist background peoples. There's fewer than 1% believers in these groups. And
Wow.
even in places like Thailand, where missionaries have served here for in the modern missions age, nearly 200 years, still and freely, we have no restrictions on sharing the gospel here. There's still less than 1%, about a half of 1%, really, of Christians that are Thai people that come out of that Buddhist background. It's a challenging place, and we just realized, the founders of Change the Map just realized, hey, we can work so hard, we can use great strategy, we can try our hardest, and we've done it for hundreds of years, literally, and with very little results. But until there is a powerful, a strong intercessory background, we're just not going to see breakthroughs. And so, Change the Map was raised up to raise up intercessors to help bring those breakthroughs, to really stand behind the missionaries and the churches and the Christians that are here on the ground, and pray for breakthroughs.
Okay, so how does it work if someone's interested in joining with Change the Map? How can they do that?
There's a website called ctm.world, WORLD, ctm.world. And if they go to that website, that's one way to do it. On the first page there'll be a place where they can click to sign up to receive monthly prayer guides that are sent out. And then in a very short time, they're going to start sending out weekly reminders. And those prayer guides have a story, tell a brief story about something that's happening currently in the Buddhist world, from all over the Buddhist world, not just here in Southeast Asia, but throughout China, Tibetan Buddhism, in Mongolia, in Bhutan, in Sri Lanka, which is also a Theravada Buddhist country, and all Japan, in Taiwan, all over these major Buddhist countries. Stories are told, and then prayer requests. One prayer subject for each week is
Hmm.
listed on those prayer guides, and then reminders sent out weekly, challenging people to pray on the Buddhist holy day. Did you know there's a Buddhist holy day?
Mm,
Most people don't know. It's not
yeah.
Sunday, it's not Friday, it's not Saturday, but it's a revolving day based on the phases of the moon. So every
Okay.
full moon, every half moon, and every new moon. So there's two half moons and a full moon and a new moon each month. That is a Buddhist holy day where most Buddhists uh, uh, believe that they make merit on those days they get double merit, extra merit for the efforts that they make. So we're praying for Buddhists on those Buddhist holy days.
Yeah, well, certainly a great initiative, and we will put all that information, your website and everything, in our show notes on our website. Mark, how have you seen prayer mobilize people to the mission field?
Oh, wow. I believe, first of all, that prayer moves circumstances and moves situations. And the more we've prayed for people groups, the more we've seen responses. So that's a direct way that prayer mobilizes people. But I really believe the main way that prayer mobilizes people is because when people start to pray for a need, their hearts begin to open up to God, directing them to the field. And I've seen it over and over again that when people get passionate about prayer, and it's easy to get passionate for the Buddhist world. Dave, one of the things that we've started to do, I've started working with some of the Change the Map Vision teams, and what that is bringing missions leaders and pastors out here to the Buddhist world and bringing them to the darkest temples, which maybe sounds, I don't know, sounds odd, might sound risky to people, and it is risky. You have to come spiritually prepared, but bringing them to the darkest temples. For example, there's two right here in Bangkok that we bring people to. One is the Hell Temple, we call it, but there are depictions in all over this temple of people getting tortured, and the concept is that after you die, before you get reborn, you have to pay for some of the bad deeds that you've done through torture, a torturous sort of a purgatory time. And so there's statues, life size and even bigger than life statues all over this temple, hundreds of them or maybe thousands of them, showing people going through all kinds of horrible torture. Uh, and and there's just a demonic presence about that whole place. The founding monk is encased, is dead long ago, but is encased in a glass case for all to see. And there's a powerful spiritual darkness about that temple. Then we go from there to the tattoo temple. Now it's believed that tattoos are a way to protect you from spiritual powers or to place spiritual powers in you. And so these there are monks that create their own ink through hair and things and body parts from ancestors, and through meditation and prayer and so forth. They basically dedicate their ink preparation to demonic powers. And then people that come in and want to be tattooed, they meditate over that and really put the power of demonic powers into that person through the applying of tattoos. One guy kept getting bothered by a demon. He would go to the temple and get another tattoo, and the demon would let him alone for a while, and then he would be bothered again and go back until his entire body, from his head to his toe, was covered with tattoos. And now the demonic spirit is attacking more and more, and he has to get tattoos over tattoos. But
Wow.
this is an extremely, extremely dark place. So we take people to these places, and there's temples all over the Buddhist world that are very, very powerful spiritual places. And we prayer walk these temples, but it's an illustration of how deep and how dark the Buddhist world is, and explains too why it's so difficult to reach them for the gospel. But when people start praying intensely for these powerful places of spiritual darkness, that mobilizes not only their heart, but it mobilizes them to the field too, because that kind of passion has to translate into going somewhere and doing something.
Absolutely. And prayer is such a huge mobilizer. In several studies, it's noted that that God speaks to his people through prayer, calling them to the field. And so it's called Change the Map. And it's a way that you, as a missions pastor, a missionary, or a mobilizer, can encourage those that you're in friendships with, those that you're trying to mobilize, a way that you can mobilize prayer for the Buddhist world. And certainly these stories that you're sharing, Mark, show the importance of mobilizing prayer for Buddhists. So I want to thank you so much for taking the time to be with us today. And if our listeners would like to learn more about you and your ministry, can they just do that through ctm.world, or are you guys on Facebook and Instagram as well?
Yeah, actually, Change the Map also has Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter posts as well. Look for Change the Map on all of those things. And actually, on the website itself, ctm.world, there's a place where you can contact us, and I'll get those emails sent on to me too. So they can contact me that way.
Sounds great. Well, before we go today, we'd like to thank Trinity Bible College and Graduate School, who helped sponsor this podcast. Trinity offers bachelor's degrees in pastoral ministries and intercultural studies, and a new graduate degree. Check this out. It's an intercultural studies graduate degree with an optional concentration in missions mobilization. For more information, you can visit trinitybiblecollege.edu. Mark, again, it was so great having you on the show today. Thanks again so much for being with us.
Thank you. It was a delight to be here, David. I appreciate it.
And until next time, everybody, let's keep passionately praying for more laborers to work in his harvest fields.
You've been listening to the Missionary Mobilization Podcast, a ministry of the Center for Missionary Mobilization and Retention at Trinity Bible College and Graduate School. You can access free resources online at missionarymobilization.org. Also, follow us on Facebook and Instagram at Missionary Mobilization. Thanks for listening.